You are building a circular grave for your own family, Henrik, and the mountain will bury you in it before the winter is out. These were the harsh, unyielding words of Silas Mercer, echoing across the clearing as the autumn wind swept down the rugged spine of the Bridger Mountains in late September of 1876. Silas, a man who had survived a decade of Montana winters by adhering strictly to the ways of his fathers, stood with his arms crossed, watching a scene that defied every scrap of common sense known to the Prosset frontier. Before him stood Henrik Solberg, a quiet, broad-shouldered immigrant who had arrived from the high mountain fjords of Norway only a year prior. Henrik had experienced his first American winter in a standard, drafty log cabin, and he had nearly paid for that experience with his life, shivering beneath piles of damp furs while the wind howled through the log seams. But Henrik was not a man to suffer the same mistake twice. In his youth, high in the 230N.com, windswept highlands of Stavanger, he had watched his grandfather construct the Clayand, ancient Steinbu circular stone shelters that huddled against the gales, holding the earth's warmth like a tightly closed fist. Henrik remembered those structures, and more importantly, he remembered the deep, radiant heat lived inside them long after the hearth fire had turned to gray ash. Now, standing on his own 160 acres of pine and granite, he was determined to bring that ancient memory to life, even if every builder in the Gran territory called him a fool. The autumn in the Bitterroot Valley was deceptively beautiful, a canvas of gold and crimson leaves that rustled with a cold, dry warning. But to the men who gathered at the local Stevensville trading post, the beauty of the season was merely a ticking clock. Everyone was frantically preparing for the inevitable freeze, felling tall, straight lodgepole pines, squaring them with broadaxes, and stacking them into the familiar, sensible rectangles of frontier cabins. They worked in groups, helping one another raise heavy timber walls and packing the gaps with wet mud and moss. It was a community bound by a shared set of rules that had kept them alive for generations. Yet Henrik worked, entirely alone, ignored by the communal work parties, selecting dense sandstone and limestone blocks from a dry creek bed 3 miles south and hauling them back on a crude wooden stone boat. If you want to learn the lost secrets of frontier survival and discover how our ancestors outsmarted the elements when life was a daily battle, take a moment to subscribe our channel and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Because Henrik's story proves that sometimes the most profound solutions are found not by looking forward into complex technologies, but by looking backward into the forgotten wisdom of the past. While the rest of the valley relied on the sheer thickness of square logs, Henrik spent his evenings sitting by his temporary camp lantern, sketching curves in the dirt with a pointed stick. He had spent the previous winter observing the houses of his neighbors, particularly the well-built home of Jebediah Jeb Thorne, the most respected carpenter in the region. Jeb's cabin was a masterpiece of traditional craftsmanship, featuring perfectly square corners and tightly packed chinking. Yet, Henrik had noticed a fatal flaw in the design. When the bitter northwest winds screamed down from the peaks, they did not simply slide past the flat, vertical faces of the wooden walls. Instead, they slammed directly into them, building up localized high-pressure zones that forced freezing air through even the tightest seams. This was convective cooling at its most relentless. The wind scoured the warmth directly off the exterior wood, pulling thermal energy out of the home faster than a roaring fireplace could replace it. Furthermore, the square corners of these traditional cabins acted as stagnant pockets where cold air pooled and settled, completely cut off from the circular flow of heat generated by a central stove. The kui, or wood piles, of his neighbors were another source of deep concern for Henrik. Stacked outdoors under simple lean-tos, the firewood was constantly exposed to freeze-thaw cycles and drifting snow, absorbing moisture until the Wood fibers were saturated. When thrown onto a fire, this damp fuel hissed and groaned, spending more than half its energy merely boiling off the internal water before it could begin to produce actual heat, clogging the chimneys with a thick, dangerous layer of creosote. Henrik knew that a different approach was required, one that did not fight the wind but deflected it, and one that stored heat rather than letting it bleed into the atmosphere. His solution was a double-walled circular structure. He began by laying out a perfect circle, 16 feet in diameter, on a cleared patch of ground. He erected a light wooden frame of circular posts, but instead of stacking a single layer of logs, he planned to build two thin wooden walls, separated by a 14-inch gap. In that gap, he would stack the thousands of pounds of river stone he was hauling from the valley, creating a massive, continuous ring of thermal mass that would act as a battery for the cabin's heat, shielded entirely from the freezing, outside winds by the outer wooden shell. The news of Henrik's circular stone project traveled quickly through the valley, becoming the primary source of entertainment at the Stevensville trading post. On a chilly Saturday morning in October, Silas Mercer and Jeb Thorne stood by the dry goods counter, sharing a pot of black coffee and laughing openly at the latest reports of the Norwegian's progress. "He's building a grain silo with a drain silo door," Silas remarked, shaking his head as he warmed his hands near the post's iron stove. "I saw him yesterday, dragging a load of river rocks that must have weighed 2 tons, his horse looking ready to drop. He's going to spend the whole autumn stacking rocks just to freeze to death inside a damp, dark oven." Jeb Thorne, ridding his pipe of spent tobacco, nodded in agreement, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had built half the chimneys in the territory. "Stone is a conductor of cold, not heat," Jeb declared to the gathered crowd of farmers and trappers. "If you don't believe me, go touch a boulder in January. It'll tear the skin right off your palm. A stone fireplace works because you build the fire inside it, but Henrik is building his whole house inside the fire. Stone. He's surrounding himself with a giant cold sink that will suck every bit of warmth out of his bones." The laughter that echoed through the trading post was not malicious, but it was born of a deep, unquestioning certainty. To these frontiersmen, the rectangular log cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of civilization, a proven design that had tamed the wilderness from the forests of Pennsylvania to the mountains of Oregon. Anyone who deviated from this blueprint was not merely eccentric, they were dangerously naive, playing a foolish game with a Montana winter that had no mercy for theorists. Silas Mercer's wife, who had watched Henrik struggle to haul his stones past their property line, even suggested sending a delegation to talk some sense into him, worried for his survival. But Jeb Thorne waved the concern away, confident that the first hard frost of the frost of the first hard frost of the first hard frost, November would cure the Norwegian of his stubbornness. "Let him pile his rocks," Jeb said with a wry smile. "Some men have to feel the frost on their blankets before they learn to trust the broadaxe. He'll be begging to sleep in Silas's barn before the first blizzard of January has run its course." And so, the community watched from a distance, secure in their traditional knowledge, while Henrik Solberg returned to his clearing, picked up his hammer, and continued to stack the cold, silent bones of the earth. The physical labor of gathering the stone was a relentless, bone-crushing ordeal that wore Henrik's body down to sinew and resolve. Each morning, long before the tourney, sun had cleared the jagged peaks of the Bridger Range, Henrik hitched his heavy draft horse to the wooden stone boat, a crude, flat-bottomed sled designed to slide over dirt and pine needles. The journey to the dry creek bed was 3 miles of rocky uphill terrain, and the return trip was even more treacherous, with the sled loaded to its absolute limit with dense, heavy stones. Henrik did not select his rocks randomly. He sought out specific materials with an organized and methodical eye. For the outer portions of the wall, he chose dense, dark granite, knowing its high density would resist the structural pressure of the building. For the inner face, the side that would directly look into his living space, he sought out porous, light-colored sandstone. He had learned from his grandfather that sandstone possessed a unique ability to release its stored heat slowly and evenly, acting as a gentle radiator that he would not scorch the skin, but would breathe warmth back into a room over many hours. By the end of October, Henrik had hauled more than 12,000 pounds of stone, nearly 6 tons of rock to his clearing. His hands were mapped with deep, bleeding cracks from the sharp edges of the granite, and his shoulders ached, with a deep, permanent fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. But when he looked at the massive piles of stone surrounding his circular foundation, he felt a quiet, profound sense of progress. He began the construction of the parter double walls, erecting the outer wooden shell of thin, tightly notched lodgepole pine logs to act as a windbreak, and then building an inner wooden lining 14 inches away. In the gap between them, he began to lay the stone core. He placed each rock by hand, fitting them together like the pieces of a giant, three-dimensional puzzle, minimizing the air gaps and packing the spaces with a thick mortar made of local yellow clay and dried river grass. He knew that the foundation had to be exceptionally strong to support this immense weight, so he had excavated a trench 4 feet deep, digging through the soft topsoil until he reached the solid, unyielding bedrock of the mountain, filling it with large, interlocking fieldstones that would not shift or crack when the winter frost caused the ground to heave. As November arrived, the autumn weather turned sharp and hostile, bringing the first hard freezes that threatened to ruin Henrik's project. Clay mortar is a living material. It requires water to remain pliable during application, and it must dry slowly to form a strong, permanent bond between the stones. If the water within the wet mortar froze before the clay could dry, the ice would expand, fracturing the delicate bonds and causing the entire double-walled structure to lose its integrity, turning his carefully stacked stone core into a loose, dangerous pile of rubble when the spring thaw arrived. The temperature, during the first week of November, regularly dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset, and the cold winds began to dry out the mortar too, quickly during the day, threatening to crack the joints. The old master masons of the territory watched Henrik's clearing with smug satisfaction, expecting him to abandon the project as the freeze set in. But Henrik had anticipated this crisis, drawing on a technique he had seen used in the high valleys of Norway during late-season builds. He constructed a massive, temporary tent out of heavy canvas and poles, completely enclosing his rising circular cabin like a giant, protective cocoon. Inside this heated shelter, Henrik set up 2 small iron braziers filled with glowing charcoal, maintaining a constant, moderate temperature that kept the air inside the tent well above freezing, allowing the mortar to cure naturally under ideal conditions. To further lower the freezing point of the moisture within his clay, Henrik mixed a precise amount of coarse salt and wood ash into his mortar paste, an ancient additive that prevented ice crystals from forming even if the temperature inside the tent dipped during the coldest hours of the night. He worked tirelessly inside the smoky, warm enclosure, his face blackened by soot, and his eyes stinging from the wood smoke, setting stone after stone in the dim, flickering light. While his neighbors warm in their finished cabins joked about the Norwegian smokehouse on the hill, Henrik was quietly ensuring that his thermal battery was built to last for generations, its mortar curing to a hardness that rivaled the granite it bound together. On the 15th of November, as Henrik was preparing to dismantle his curing dado tent and raise the sod-insulated roof, Silas Mercer made one final attempt to intervene. Silas rode into the clearing, his horse's breath pluming in the crisp morning air, and stood at the entrance of the canvas tent, watching Henrik smooth the final course of clay mortar near the top of the 7-foot wall. "I've come to give you a neighbor's warning, Henrik," Silas said, his voice grave with genuine concern. The wind is shifting to the north, and the elders are saying we're in for an Alberta clipper before the week is out. If you stay up here, under this pile of wet clay and loose rock, you're risking more than just your pride. When that stone freezes, the moisture in those logs will warp, and the weight of that roof will bring the whole mess down on your head while you sleep. Pack your bedroll, come down to my place, and winter in my cabin. No, one will think poorly of you. Lars didn't look up from his work. Beams are notched into bedrock. Ventilation's got 3 separate pathways. Stove draws clean. Silas Mercer sighed, shaking his head as he pulled his wool hat down over his ears. "A stubborn man is a hard construct to mend," he muttered, turning his horse back toward the valley trail. "I'll leave a lantern burning in my window, Henrik. When the cold finds you, you'll know which way to run." 2 days later, Henrik finished the roof, covering the lodgepole rafters with a thick layer of birch, bark, and 18 inches of packed mountain sod, sealing his circular sanctuary just as the first heavy, silent snowflakes began to fall. The blizzard did not begin with a gentle flurry. It arrived like an invading army, preceded by a sudden, terrifying drop in atmospheric pressure that made the pine needles in the valley stand on end. On the morning of December 18th, the wind shifted violently to the north, bringing a mass of frigid, dense air straight down from the frozen expanses of Alberta. Within 6 hours, the temperature in the Bridger Valley plummeted from a comfortable 24 degrees Fahrenheit to 18 degrees below zero, and by midnight, the thermometer mounted outside the Stevensville General Store registered a numbing 38 below. The wind rumbled through the mountain passes at a sustained speed of 45 miles per hour, with gusts that exceeded 60, turning the blank, dry, powdery snow into a blinding, horizontal sheet of ice crystals that felt like flying sand against any exposed skin. It was the kind of cold that did not merely chill the body. It threatened to stop the heart, freezing moisture in the lungs of anyone foolish enough to draw a deep breath without a wool scarf covering their mouth. Inside his circular stone cabin, Henrik Solberg sat calmly by his central hearth, listening to the relentless roar of the wind as it battered the outer Sow's wooden shell. But unlike his first winter in Montana, he felt no draft, no icy fingers of wind reaching through the seams to steal the warmth from his bones. The aerodynamic curve of his circular wall allowed the screaming gales to slide harmlessly past, deflecting the wind's immense pressure and preventing the right mass formation of those localized drafts that plagued square cabins. The outer wooden shell took the brunt of the storm's fury, while the 14-inch core of sandstone and granite sat protected, absorbing the heat generated by the moderate wood fire Henrik had built in his central stove. The temperature inside his cabin had risen steadily over the first 24 hours of the storm, reaching 64 degrees Fahrenheit and holding there with absolute stability. A warm, radiant oasis of calm in the midst of an Arctic wasteland that was rapidly freezing the valley around him. 2 miles south, in the beautifully constructed, square-cornered log cabin of Jeb Thorne, the reality of the winter blast was proving to be a nightmare of survival. Jeb, who had spent decades perfecting his carpentry, found himself engaged in a desperate, around-the-clock battle against the elements. The wind, hitting the flat western face of his home with the force of a battering ram, had found every minute gap in the plaster chinking, driving jets of freezing air into the main room that snuffed out candles and kept the floor temperature at a numbing 28 degrees. Jeb's fireplace, a massive structure of quarried granite, was running at full capacity, its chimney pouring a thick, dark column of pine smoke into the storm. But the heat from the roaring fire was being lost, almost instantly, pulled up the flue by the powerful draft or scoured off the exterior log surfaces by the convective action of the wind. Jeb's koi, stacked neatly under his western lean-to, had become a single frozen mass of snow and ice, requiring him to venture into the screaming gale every 2 hours, with a heavy iron wedge and a splitting maul just to break loose enough logs to keep the fire going. When thrown onto the coals, the icy wood hissed and steamed, producing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the cabin and sent his courting acrid family coughing into their bedrolls. Jeb checked his indoor thermometer, a high-quality mercury instrument he had brought from Boston, and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The temperature near the floor read 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and frost was beginning to form on the iron nails of his interior walls, creeping upward like white frozen fingers toward the ceiling. His family sat huddled in their heaviest winter coats, wrapped in layers of wool, blankets, taking turns watching the firebox, because letting the fire die for even an hour meant letting the cabin drop below the freezing point, a consequence that could prove fatal in a storm that showed no signs of breaking. At the home of Silas Mercer, the situation was even more critical. Silas's cabin, sitting on an exposed rise near the river, was taking the full force of the wind, and by the third night of the storm, his firewood reserves were crazier than he had ever anticipated. Silas had burned through more than a cord of wood in just 4 days, a rate of consumption that threatened to empty his shed long before the end of January. His youngest daughter, Emily, had developed a deep, rattling cough that kept her awake through the night, her small body shivering, despite being positioned as close to the hearth as Silas dared to place her. The air in their cabin was damp and heavy with the moisture from melting snow, creating a cold, humid environment that made every breath a struggle for the young girl. During the darkest hours of December 23rd, Silas woke to a sudden, terrifying silence from the hearth. He scrambled out of his bedroll, his boots slipping on a layer of ice that had formed on the wooden floorboards, and found that the fire had burned down to cold ash while he slept. The temperature inside the room had dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 3 hours, and the water bucket sitting on his kitchen table was frozen solid. Silas reached for his daughter's hand and found her fingers stiff and blue, the first signs of frostbite beginning to take hold on her toes as well. He worked frantically in the dark, his hands shaking so violently he could barely strike a match, using a handful of dry shingles and his last bottle of kerosene to coax a weak flame back to life. As he stood over the smoldering fire, listening to his daughter's labored breathing and the relentless scream of the wind outside, Silas Mercer felt the bitter weight of his own pride, and he looked toward the Clays northern ridge where Henrik's cabin stood, wondering if the young Norwegian was still alive or if the mountain had claimed him as well. The blizzard finally blew itself out on the morning of December 27th, leaving the Bitterroot Valley buried under 4 feet of packed heavy snow that had transformed the landscape into a silent, frozen wilderness. Silas Mercer, his face wrapped in wool and his body exhausted from days of sleepless vigil, prepared to make the trek to Henrik's clearing. He roped himself to his horse, knowing that a single misstep in the deep drifts could plunge him into a hidden ravine, and set out with a heavy heart, fully expecting to find his neighbor's circular cabin, cold and silent, a monument to a tragic mistake. As he neared the Blades and Anison, an ever-wanted tragic mistake, Northern Ridge, Silas struggled to recognize the clearing. The wind had built a ditage, massive snowdrift, on the northwest side of Henrik's property that reached all the way to the cabin's sod roof, burying the structure like a giant white dune. But as Silas got closer, he noticed a thin, steady wisp of pale gray smoke rising from the central roof vent. It was not the thick, black plume of a black, struggling fire, but the light, almost invisible breath of an efficient, hot burn. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking to his thighs in the snow, and made his way to the southeast entrance, which Henrik's baffle wall had kept remarkably clear of drifts. He reached out and knocked on the heavy wooden door, his hand gloved in frozen leather. He waited, his breath pluming in the silent air, and was about to knock again when he heard the heavy wooden latch slide back. The door swung inward, and Silas Mercer was instantly pushed back by a wave of warmth that felt like stepping into a greenhouse in the middle of July. There stood Henrik Solberg, wearing nothing but a light flannel shirt and trousers, his face relaxed and a warm smile on his weathered features. Henrik greeted him with a nod and gestured for Silas to come in, asking him to sit by the warm sandstone wall. News of Henrik's survival and the remarkable warmth of his circular cabin spread through the valley as soon as the trail was cleared. Jeb Thorne, refusing to believe the stories of Henrik's comfort, arrived at the clearing on New El Sardi Year's Day, accompanied by 3 other skeptical ranchers. Jeb carried his expensive Boston mercury thermometer, determined to prove that Henrik's wall thermometer was faulty, or that the Norwegian was using some hidden trick, perhaps burning coal he had smuggled from the railway depot to maintain his temperatures. Jeb stepped into the circular cabin, his eyes scanning the room with the sharp, suspicious gaze of an investigator. He went straight to the blank center stove, checking the air intake and the flue pipe, searching for any signs of an auxiliary heater or a double firebox. He found nothing but a small, steady fire burning a few pieces of dry cottonwood. Jeb then began a physical inspection of the cabin, walking the perimeter and placing his hands against the stone walls at different heights. In a traditional cabin, the walls were always the coldest surface, radiating an icy chill that forced occupants to remain near the center of the room. But as Jeb touched Henrik's sandstone inner lining, his hand felt a warm, gentle heat that radiated uniformly from the rock, as if the wall itself were a living, breathing thing. He placed his mercury thermometer at the coldest spot in the cabin, the far north side near the floor, and waited 20 minutes, watching the silver column rise. When he pulled the instrument away, his jaw went slack. The thermometer read exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He stepped outside, where the Prosidau A-18 afternoon sun cast a cold blue light on the snow and hung the thermometer from a pine branch. The mercury plummeted rapidly, settling at 4 degrees above zero. The temperature inside Henrik's cabin was holding at 68, while Silas Mercer's cabin was struggling to stay at 36. Henrik's roundstone cabin was exactly 32 degrees warmer than the frozen wooden structures of his neighbors, maintained on a fraction of the wood they consumed. Jeb Thorne stood in the snow, looking at the thermometer in his hand, and admitted that the design actually worked. The verification of Henrik's success was not based on mere impressions. It was grounded in the unyielding numbers of Henrik's daily logbook, which he laid out on the wooden table for Jeb and Silas to examine. Henrik's records, kept with the neat, structured hand of an experienced builder, showed that throughout the 6 days of the extreme cold wave, his cabin had maintained an average interior temperature of 66 degrees Fahrenheit, never dropping below 56 even in the early morning hours before the fire was relit. To achieve this, Henrik had burned an average of only 12 logs of cottonwood per day, totaling less than half a cord of wood for the entire 2 weeks of December. By contrast, Silas Mercer's ledger showed a consumption of nearly 3 cords of seasoned fir over the same period, while his interior temperature had averaged a freezing 38 degrees, leaving his daughter Emily with frostbite and a dangerous lung infection. Henrik explained the system's thermal mass. When the fire burned in the center, the heat traveled the same distance to every stone in the wall. The limestone on the inside absorbed that energy, storing it in its dense mass. The outer log wall acted as the coat that protected the battery. It kept the northwest wind from ever touching the stone, so the cold could never draw the heat outward. When the fire went out at midnight, the stone continued to release its stored warmth back into the room all through the night at a rate of 2 degrees of cooling per hour. The neighbors were burning their wood to heat the wind, while Henrik was burning his wood to heat his walls. Silas Mercer looked at the logbook, then at his own hands, which were still raw and peeling from the cold. He thought of his daughter's blue fingers, and the fear that had gripped his blue fingers' heart during that terrible night of December 23rd. He looked at Henrik, admitting his regret, noting that while they called him a fool, he was the only one who kept the children safe. The spring of 1877 brought more than just the melting of the mountain snows. It brought a quiet, profound revolution to the construction of homes in the Bitterroot Valley. The mockery that had defined the previous autumn was completely gone, replaced by a deep, communal desire to learn the secrets of the Norwegian hunter's circular stone cabin. Henrik Solberg did not gloat over his place and said it. Victory. He did not charge his neighbors for his advice, or refuse to share his diagrams. Instead, when the building season began in May, Henrik became the most sought-after advisor in the territory, traveling from clearing to help his neighbors lay out the perfect circles of their new homes. Under his guidance, 9 circular stone cabins were raised in the valley that summer, including a beautiful, larger version built for Silas Mercer's family, featuring walls of pink sandstone that held the afternoon heat long into the summer nights. Jeb Thorne, the carpenter who had been Henrik's most vocal critic, became the technique's most enthusiastic promoter, using his carpentry skills to refine the double-walled design and developing adjustable ventilation panels that allowed families to control the convective airflow within the stone core. The term Reinhardt Wall, a regional adaptation of Henrik's design, entered the vocabulary of frontier builders, spreading across Montana, Wyoming, and into the Touri territories of the Dakotas. The children who had once chanted Roundhouse in the streets of Stevensville, now gathered at Henrik's cabin on winter afternoons, sitting on the warm sandstone floorboards and listening to his stories of the old country while the wind howled harmlessly against the outer wooden shell. The community had been transformed, not by a new, expensive technology, but by the quiet, unyielding power of a forgotten truth, proving that survival on the frontier was not a matter of fighting the elements with bigger fires, but of understanding them with a humble, observing mind. More than a century has passed since Henrik Solberg laid the first limestone block of his circular cabin in the autumn of 1876, and the valley of the Bitterroot has changed beyond all recognition, filled now with modern homes of brick, concrete, and high-efficiency electric heating systems. Yet, if you take the old mountain trail that winds up the northern ridge of the Bridger Range, you will still find Henrik's round stone cabin standing silent and strong among the pines, its walls of sandstone and granite as solid as the day they were laid. The outer wooden shell has weathered to a beautiful silvery gray, and the sod roof is now a wild garden of mountain flowers that bloom in the brief summers, but the structure remains structurally sound, a timeless monument to the power of human ingenuity and the stubborn wisdom of the past. When modern building scientists from the university traveled to the site in the late 20th century to measure the thermal performance of Henrik's double-walled system, they were astonished to discover that the ancient design operated on the exact principles of insulated thermal mass and passive solar heat storage that form the core of today's most advanced green architecture. The simple mountain hunter, working alone with a draft horse and a wooden sled, had anticipated by nearly a century the innovations that modern engineering is only now rediscovering as the key to sustainable, energy-efficient living. His cabin stands as a silent reminder that the solutions to our greatest challenges are often waiting for us in the memories of those who came before, if only we have the humility to look back and learn. For those who still hear the cold wind ruffling through the pines and wonder how to build a life that stands firm against the storms of tomorrow, Henrik's story remains a guiding light, proving that warmth is not something we must constantly fight to generate, but something we can learn to hold and share. Every winter, when the snow falls heavy on the Bridger Peaks and the temperatures drop below zero, the old-timers in the valley still tell the story of the Norwegian who built round when everyone else built square, and how his crazy stone wall kept his family warm while the rest of the world froze. Because the truest warmth is not found in the heat of a temporary flame, but in the enduring strength of a temporary flame, design that respects the laws of nature, and the quiet courage of a man who refused to let the cold define his survival.